This video is going to be a lot of fun, and I'm really excited to share it with you. Here at the GPT agency, we do a lot of work building podcast scripts. Podcasts are a hugely popular medium right now, and it can be hard to create podcast content week after week after week after week after week. So occasionally, we will write podcast scripts. And I'm really excited for this video. Of course, true crime podcasts are extremely popular. And I thought I would walk you through how I would very quickly build a podcast script for a 15 to 25-minute podcast using OpenAI and ChatGPT. And to do so, I am going to tell you my favorite true crime story ever, and that is the story of Everett Dushk, who in 13, framed a local Elvis impersonator named James Clark in the town of Tupelo, Mississippi, by sending ricin, which is a poison, to President Barack Obama in order to frame James for the attempted assassination of the president. It is an absolutely wild story, and this GQ article, written by Wells Tower, is probably one of my favorite things I've ever read. If you need a break from this course, when you're done with this video, go read this in its entirety. It's hilarious. So he does a really good job of breaking down the story. And I would say, summarize this article for me. So the article, it takes about 35 minutes to read. It is a pretty dense, long article. And so really quick, in April 2013, Paul Kevin Curtis, an Elvis impersonator, was arrested and accused of sending ricin-laced letters to President Barack Obama and other officials. The charges were later dropped due to a lack of evidence, and Curtis was released from custody. It was later discovered that the letters were actually sent by another individual, J. Everett Dushk, who was subsequently arrested and convicted for the crime. The article discusses the case and its aftermath, including the impact on Curtis and his family. And so if I wanted to start building a podcast from this, I would say, write me a 5-point outline for a comedy podcast detailing the events of this article. And so quickly, it'll give you introduction, setting the scene for the bizarre and unexpected events that are about to unfold. To the arrest, detail the arrest of Paul Kevin Curtis, the Elvis impersonator, and the initial suspicions that he was responsible for sending ricin-laced letters to President Barack Obama and other officials. 3, the investigation, explore the investigation into the case, including the evidence against Curtis and the efforts to track down the real perpetrator. 4, the twist, reveal the surprising twist that the real culprit was J. Everett Dushk and discuss how he was eventually caught and convicted for the crime. 5, the aftermath, discuss the impact of the case on Curtis and his family, and consider the lesson that can be learned from this strange and unfortunate series of events. And so this is great. This is a pretty good outline. It really does detail like how essentially the basic structure of a true crime podcast. And so I could say, write me I'll do probably I would say 1,000-word introduction, but since I'm reading it just for time, I'm going to say write me a 750-word introduction in a fun comedic format for write me a 750-word, I'm going to say script detailing the events of point 1. This is good. You can just reference the numbers whenever they give you numbers for a true crime podcast. The podcast is very funny, and it's named. I'm just gonna make up a name. I'm just gonna make up a totally random name. My Favorite Murder. That's not a podcast at all. Okay. So, welcome to My Favorite Murder, the true crime podcast that's more about the absurdity of it all than the actual murders. And boy, do we have a doozy of a case for you today. It's April 2013, and Elvis impersonator Paul Kevin Curtis is minding his own business, probably belting out some classic tunes in his best Presley voice, when all of a sudden, the FBI shows up at his door. They accuse him of sending ricin-laced letters to President Barack Obama and other officials, and Curtis is arrested on the spot. At first, it seems like an open and shut case. The letters were signed, "I am KC, and I approve this message," which just so happens to be Curtis's initials and catchphrase he often uses. Plus, the letters contain some pretty damning language, threatening the recipients and making it clear that the sender was not a fan of the government. But as the investigation goes on, things start to get a little murky. For one thing, Curtis has a solid alibi for the time when the letters were mailed. He was performing as Elvis at a party, and there are plenty of witnesses who can vouch for his whereabouts. Additionally, it turns out that Curtis had a long standing grudge against the government and had frequently ranted about his perceived injustices on social media and in letters to officials. But despite this, those who knew him describe him as a harmless eccentric, not someone capable of committing such a crime. As the days goes on, it becomes increasingly clear that the evidence against Curtis is circumstantial at best, and then a bombshell. The FBI announces they found trace amounts of ricin on a letter Curtis sent to a local judge, but not on the letters sent to the president and other officials. So if Curtis didn't send the letters, who did? Enter J. Everett Dushk, a man with a grudge against Curtis who had recently been involved in a physical altercation with him. Dushk had also recently purchased a machine that could be used to make ricin, and when confronted by authorities, he initially claimed that the machine was for making tumbleweeds. Yeah, sure it was. In the end, Dushk was arrested and charged with the crime, while Curtis was released from custody and all charges against him were dropped. It was a wild ride and one that left Curtis and his family shaken. But hey, at least we got a... Okay, so then it gives an outro. But this is the intro. You could go point by point and ask you to write 750 words about each one of these, and in the end, you would have a 3,000 word script for a pretty well written podcast. Oftentimes, it can be best to ask them to do the outline, take the introduction, copy it, take the article that you're having summarized, and pretty much all true crime podcasts will operate. Write me an intro for my podcast based on the initial events of this article, and it will spit it out. It'll be a little bit easier, and it won't tell the entire story. And then you can do the same, just create multiple chat threads on the side. And so this is a really, really, really good way to. I should have written 750 words. That's why it's so short. This is a really, really easy way to create a lot of podcast content really quickly. For any content creators or people that work with content creators, this is a really incredible feature.